The First Majus in Space 1003 AAW Part 1 First Flight of the Vimana Aryuman. The houses of the Magi are vastly different in scope, yet none are considered above the others. Each has a balance for the other 5. The House of Healing may undo the House of Communication's change. One from the House of Strength could stand firm against the draw of the House of Potential, and the House of Grace can evade the House of Power's raw might. Fragment of a parchment, dated circa 550 BAW. Origon pushed through the multitudes packing the arena on the outskirts of Kashadir City. A great shrouded hulk loomed in the distance at the far end of the crowded space, big as a building. If he remembered correctly, this used to be a forest at the edge of the city. The plain was flat, compacted dirt now, soon to be baked earth if the hot and sunny weather held. Odd to place a lone construction out here, then pack people around it. Mythium was already the most populous of the 10 homeworlds, and members of other species had been arriving all morning at the portal ground from their own far-flung worlds, or from the Nether. Excited babble assaulted him on all sides, and air currents carried their intent in the trills of the symphony of communication. "Look there, Mama!" A child Globoth, her head-tails not yet long enough to braid.
"They told me it was bigger than a building. They weren't lying."
2 Festoor, in conversation.
"What does it do? Why now?"
"How much did you spend on that?"
He could hear tension of alien species in the music, wondering at the presumption of the Methiemum. This latest proof of their technological arrogance grated on the slower and more cautious species. He was not so bothered. The trader species made a lot of interesting gadgets.
"Get your fried kielbasa!"
Origon's feathery crest ruffled as a hawker jostled past him with a tray of sausages that smelled overcooked and over-seasoned. No sense killing it and wasting the meat with all that spice. Belatedly, he moved a long-fingered hand over the inside pocket of his colorful robe where he kept his coins. No one would dare steal from a Majus, but in this crowd, a cut purse might not even realize from whom he was stealing. As he shoved closer, smoothing his mustache down, he eyed the structure at the front of the crowd, surrounded by ladders and scaffolding. The canny Methiemum had an open invitation to anyone and everyone to watch the unveiling of their grand invention. If they could have made a profit from it, they might have called the 10 species here to reveal a giant block of cheese, but he didn't think that was the case. The thing was the presentation, and the Methiemum were masters of it. He thrust forward, using his height and sharp elbows to create paths, and ignoring curses thrown his way.
"Oi, watch your bony arms, you great-robed buffoon!"
The angry Sereri, like a furry starved gargoyle sans wings, layered doubts upon his parentage, his furry face screwed up into a grimace. There were always those who were jealous. Origon paid him no mind. The Magi who attended should have prominent positions, and he was no exception. He finally reached the front of the arena, where a line of the mayoral guard stood at attention. The soldiers parted at a glare from him, recognizing him as a Majus from the badge with his house colors, and Origon took a place by other important people, including at least one Itanala speaker, half again as tall as he.
"Greetings, Majus,"
the speaker said, her long fingers making a graceful curve through the air. From high above, her large, pale eyes acknowledged him from a face surrounded by a mane of light hair.
"Speaker!"
He returned the greeting, settling beside her. Beings of every shape and size stretched to his right and left, pushing each other, trying to get closer to the front, though the line of guards held them back. They were before a raised stage, the Methiemum's shrouded construct towering overhead. It cast a shadow across the crowd, now reaching back to the edges of the area. The dirt plain, stretching nearly as far as he could see, was even fuller than when he arrived. A snap of material drew Origon's attention. With a cheer from the crowd, the immense sheet covering the structure dropped, folding in on itself. There was a round of gasps, and an immediate buzz of conversation. He barely suppressed his reaction, forcing his crest to lay flat, No need to look completely ignorant. He had been consulted, indirectly, on how wind currents would affect a smooth object at a great height. He was prepared for some sort of great balloon, perhaps launched from the top of a building, but this was impressive. It shone in the sunlight, bright enough to make him squint. The main structure was a cylinder of burnished metal, sleek and bright, rounding to a dome far overhead. The base and jutting fins were sparsely ornamented, as was the main shaft, but the filigree and hatching he could see was finely done. It looked like nothing so much as a giant finger, pointing to the sky. People were shielding their eyes, gesturing to the gleaming object. One of the official-looking Methiumum on the platform spoke from behind a podium. Origon thought it was the mayor of the province of Kashador, though he could hardly keep such people straight. The man's voice was amplified by a tube glowing with stored energy of the houses of communication and potential.
"Welcome, all,"
the man shaded his eyes with a hand.
"I see people from every homeworld of the great assembly of species here today. Good, good."
The man swept a hand to the great structure behind him.
"The capsule you see before you will shortly begin a monumental journey."
There were exclamations and questions from the crowd, asking how such a thing could move. But the mayor was still speaking.
"It will bring a crew of Methiumum and one of our revered magi up to our moon, Xupara."
The closest and smallest of Methium's 3 satellites. Better to start small, if such a plan was to be believed.
"Once there, the crew will explore the new land, mapping and providing the first scientific study of Xupara."
To see what minerals were available, Origon mentally translated. The audience shouted and muttered at this pronouncement. Others had come to the same conclusion. Why waste so many resources to build this thing, when the 10 homeworlds were connected by portals, an easy step from one place to another? Leave it to the Methiumum to want more than one homeworld. The mayor continued his speech, detailing how the Majus would assist flying the shuttle, establish the coordinates of a new portal ground, and bring the crew back from Xupara the short way. Origon, of course, knew all this. If Magi could simply make a portal anywhere, he would have traveled over much more of the universe. Sadly, one could only make a portal where one had been before, thus the capsule. Otherwise, every species might have ventured to their moons and to other planets in their solar system. While the mayor rambled on, telling of the construction and planning required, Origon examined the capsule. A Majus was required to fly it, as in all great acts. But as far as he could tell, the vehicle was fashioned wholly by hand, and not by Magi changing the symphony. He marveled at how much wealth the Methiumum tied up in this mechanical venture. No wonder they invited everyone to see. They could at least make some of their money back with the increased trade. The Methiumum, after all, practiced usury with abandon, which no self-respecting Kyrian would do. As the mayor spoke, a group of people climbed a tall ladder behind him, connected to a walkway at the top of the structure. They reached the top when the mayor wound up his speech.
"So we see the prowess of the Methiumum. Our species reaches out to the 9 others, showing and soon sharing what heights can be achieved by the sweat of our hands. Without even the assistance of the Magi, we have built this vehicle you see behind me."
He gestured backwards again.
"It will be the first to travel between the stars, built by the technology and ingenuity of my people, and thus I set this great craft, the Vimana Aryuman, in motion, lighting the fuse to allow its passage to Xupara."
The mayor stooped around his prominent belly and pressed a button. With a whoosh, flames banked around the capsule behind the stage, slowly building higher, to the appreciative cries of the audience. It was a show for the gullible crowds. Origon could hear the symphony of Power's strident chords deep in the melody of the shuttle. The visible flames were just a coal-fired pilot light to a great furnace stored in the belly of the capsule.
"So why is it that I am standing down here in the crowd?"
He was one of the best suited for this purpose. His abilities rare even among the ranks of the Magi. Very few could hear the symphony of 2 houses. Only 3 other Magi were members of both the House of Communication and of the House of Power. For this capsule to fly to Xupara, a Majus would be needed to control the fuel burn with the House of Power, as well as correct the shuttle's flight through the air with the House of Communication. He supposed 2 Magi could try to coordinate their changes to the symphony, but it would be much harder than 1 Majus controlling both. The mayor only mentioned having 1. Thus, the capsule required the rare Majus who could hear both symphonies at once to function at peak efficiency. Like him. Yet no one had asked him. He squinted up the walkway, looking for which Majus had been chosen in his place. One of the figures, vaguely familiar, waved from the walkway near the top of the capsule. There were only a few thousand Magi total, so many were known on sight, even to the common folk. What was his name? The mayor was speaking again, announcing the titles and names of the crew. Origon ignored the others until the mayor got to... Teju. Origon had to admit the boy was a fitting choice. Teju was the one Methiemum out of the 4 Magi in existence, with access to the houses of both communication and power. However, he was recently raised from the ranks of the apprentices, if Origon remembered correctly. A fitting choice, perhaps, but not a strong one. The pretty show flames licked the bottom of the giant cylinder. The crew would be on their way shortly, the great capsule lifting high into the air. Just one more opportunity passing him by, given to a Majus by far his inferior. The air cracked overhead, and Teju stiffened. Shouts grew in the audience, arms rose, pointing. The line of guards pushed forward. Origon swung around, searching. A glint of reflected sunlight caught his eye, but the giant Itanala next to him motioned, and her elbow caught his head and knocked him sideways. Origon scanned the arena, trying to get his bearings. He rubbed his temples.
"My apologies," the Itanala speaker said, stooping. "What do you see? What happened?"
Origon ignored her.
There!
A cloaked person, all in grey-green, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, surely sweltering in the hot Cashadur sunlight. Something flashed again, a reflection from a long metal tube, peeking out underneath the long overcoat. A projectile weapon of some sort? Origon thrust ahead, aiming for the figure.
"Move!"
he called to those in front of him. They surged, not listening. He knew he was too late, even as he fought the crowd. The cloaked figure raised the long metal cylinder to its face for a second shot, and Origon let the symphony of communication flow around him, catching chords representing air currents as they flashed by. He used his song to tune the chords, harmonizing, arranging them in a lattice. Crystalline yellow, the color of the House of Communication, outlined a tunnel before him. His alteration to the music shifted the air, magnifying his vision. Origon got a brief glance of fine hair covering a gruesome face, a flash of an eye and thin, high cheek. Then the head jerked out of his tunnel vision by the gun's recoil. It was enough to recognize one of the Soreriage, possibly even the one who had accosted him earlier. The xenophobic species was outspoken, but a rare sight on other homeworlds. Belatedly, Origon grabbed at the notes of the bullet's course, but it was far too fast, the beat frenetic, and the notes of its music slipped from him. The bullet pinged off the walkway to the capsule. It was not right that a tube with powder in it could defeat a Majus.
"May all your feathers fall out!"
he cursed the shooter. The saying might not apply outside his species, but he felt better for it. Still, some attribute of the Soreri nagged at him. Eye color? Were brown eyes common? He thought most Soreriage were orange or grey-eyed, depending on the family lineage. And the eyes looked too small. Large eyes and a gargoyle face made Soreriage generally unattractive to the other species. Yet another shot rang out. The mayoral guard were hopelessly bogged down, unable to get to the shooter. The crowd heaved against him, and Origon held onto a railing to keep his balance. 3 shots. If he was incredibly fast, the shooter might have reloaded between the first and second shot. But a third? So close? There must be another barrel to his rifle, or he had a second one, already loaded. This was no snap decision to sabotage. He followed the path of the bullets, feeling the way they cut through the melody of the air, and saw Teju slumped against the rail of the walkway. A pit of fire rose in Origon's stomach. How dare someone shoot one of the Magi? When he looked back, the shooter was gone. Someone jostled him, then he was buffeted by dozens of people running. Clothing of all colors and beings of all sizes whipped past his view, blocking any hope of seeing where the shooter went.
Ancestors' eggs!
Origon cursed, and began running against the panicked crowd. Back to the stage. He wrapped his robe close around his legs to keep it from getting stepped on. If he were high on the walkway, he might be able to see where the shooter was going, and he could help Teju. It took longer than it should have to push through the crowd. Halfway through, he gave up and extended a hand. He caught at notes, readying his song to make a windy corridor. The air resisted, and Origon cursed again. The symphony could not be changed in the same way twice, in the same place and time. This was too similar to his magnifying glass. He sighed, listening instead for the jangling chords of the Symphony of Power. They were harder to hear, discordant and irregular. People's connections in a crowd were not so easy to change as the wind. Orange light dripped from his fingers as he encouraged those in front of him to notice his importance and move aside. He ran through. When Origon reached the stage, he reversed the change he made to the Symphony of Power and regained the rest of his song. Every person was defined by their own specific vibration. Invest enough of that song permanently in changes, and what would be left? Rilan was waiting for him, plucking and fiddling with one of the white corseted dresses she was forced to wear on official business. It set off her black hair and dark features. She was here as representative of the Council of the Magi, then. He wasn't surprised. Nor was he surprised she arrived before him. She had probably been invited to sit with the officials, being Methiamum herself. He nodded to her curtly, and they both strode to the ladder leading to the walkway.
"Don't know if he'll survive,"
Rilan said, as if it hadn't been 2 cycles since they last spoke this time.
"The shooter was good. Teju is the only one here trained to set the shuttle on its way,"
Origon remarked casually. He shifted his eyes enough to see Rilan's wry expression. He had missed her. Had they truly known each other for more than 20 cycles?
"There's a good reason why you weren't chosen, Ori," she replied. "We all know you're one of the best at manipulating the houses of power and communication when they're together. But you aren't Methiamum. The government was insistent. Teju is little more than a child. Now look what has happened,"
Origon remarked. If he had been up there, he could have deflected those bullets.
"And what if we had chosen you?"
Rilan continued.
"You'd be up there chewing those Sorariage bullets right now."
Origon snorted, but ignored the jab.
"You think it is their species as well?" "Sure. Who else has trained marksmen who can hit a target that far away? Most people would miss their own foot with one of those things." "Agreed,"
Origon said. Guns had only been around for 50 or 60 cycles, one of the nastier inventions of the Methiamum. The Sorariage favored the weapons, though they had grudgingly accepted the invention at first. Most other beings still used swords and staves, trusty things with no need to reload, or crossbows for range. Origon wondered if that was where the idea for the capsule originated. It was in essence a giant gun, shooting at the ground, from what he could tell.
"In any case, that's the rumor from people who saw the shooter firsthand,"
Rilan added.
"One of the cabinet members passed it on to me."
Another reason to be included with the important people. Origon opened his mouth to say he had seen the shooter firsthand as well, but stopped. Rilan would ask for more details, and he honestly did not have any, except for brown eyes. He was beginning to doubt himself on that account. Later. They reached the ladder and began climbing. Origon kept the symphony uppermost in his mind, listening to the notes and phrases of the complex construct flash by as they rose above the milling crowds. The Symphony of Power's glissandos and trills mirrored the holes and directions of the people below, many of them still running. The symphony defined everything. What he saw was just the physical manifestation of it. The other 4 symphonies were there, too, but of course he couldn't hear them.
"Can you give us a shield?"
Roland called down to him. He shook his head, then realized she wasn't looking.
Not now. We will not be able to reach Teju.
Once created, the underlying vibration would resist him creating a second shield until he was far away from this spot, or much time had passed. He would have to hold it constant, unable to interact with Teju and the crew, or let it drop and be more or less defenseless. Only now he felt just as defenseless, climbing the multiple-story ladder. A few minutes later, they reached the top, without getting shot at. Up here, the air currents were fresher. Communication's melody almost playful. Roland hurried forward to Teju, who seemed to be the only one injured. One of the crew, probably the doctor, was already there.
"Here, Counselor,"
the doctor said to Roland. She crouched over the fallen man and pressed her hands to his abdomen, where blood ran freely. Origon saw the white and olive-green glow form around her hands, sinking into the injured Teju's belly. He always thought olive was a strange secondary color to complement the white of the House of Healing. But then, one did not choose the secondary color. It grew naturally. He was secretly happy for the anonymity of having two house colors, yellow for communication and orange for power. It meant he had no secondary color.
"Shiv's toenails!"
Roland cursed at Teju.
"Hold still. I'm a psychiatrist, not a surgeon. I'll do what I can, but you can't go dying on me."
Origon saw the crimson flow lessen slightly, and the bewhiskered doctor pressed a cloth to the wound, but there was an awful lot of blood darkening the narrow walkway. Roland had never been good at physically healing with the symphony, but then not many magi were.
"Is anyone else injured?"
he asked the shaken crew, cowering on the carpeted walk. The whole thing trembled with the smallest breath of wind, and Origon was tempted to stabilize it, but that would take too much effort and time. He asked in the trader's tongue, the common form of communication between species. He and Roland had not needed to use it, of course, being magi.
"No, Majus,"
answered one of them, an older woman with grey hair pulled into a severe bun. She looked only slightly less petrified than the rest. She and the rest of the crew were wearing matching heavy blue suits with grey piping, thick and all one piece. After a moment's contemplation, Origon knelt down, too, behind the engraved metal handrail. He wouldn't be able to see as far, but he was taller than the average Methiemum, and didn't want his top feathers shaved off by another bullet.
"Did you see the shooter?"
a crew member asked. Origon nodded.
"From very close. It was to be one of the Sororios. Now, quiet, while I find him again."
He listened to notes from the House of Power, peering over the walkway's handrail. Far below, he heard trills of fear running through the crowd. There was a strange bass line as well, which he ignored. The symphony was as complex as reality, and often more confusing. Origon traced the path of the shooter with the House of Power, reading the tremolos and vibratos of people shying away from the grey-green cloaked Sorori. The path started where Origon first glimpsed the shooter, gun to his shoulder. It cut across the crowd, the spikes of fear in the melody decreasing farther from the source. And then it vanished. Origon scratched his head, then let his crest resettle. Surely the shooter continued to cause confusion as he moved through the crowded amphitheater, but there was nothing.
"Ori!"
The shout intruded on his surveying, and he lost the thread of the music. The symphony flashed by, leaving him with no sense of the shooter's path. Origon frowned. If he wanted to track the path again, he'd have to find another way. He turned to Roland.
"What is it?"
he asked, annoyed. Roland jerked her head toward the capsule, where the crew were scuttling toward the safety of the entrance. Origon's eyes widened as the strident bass chords intruded again from the symphony of power. Smoke drifted past the edge of the scaffold, burning his nose. The dense fuel the pilot light would activate was heating up. The pilot flames had been going too long in the chaos. Soon the real fuel would start to burn, disastrous without a Majus to control it. He stroked his mustache, thinking.
"Can the pilot flames be shut off?"
he asked, again in the trader's tongue. The older woman, probably the captain, from the many bands of color on the sleeves of her jumpsuit, shook her head vigorously. She was hunched against the rail, only paces from the hatch leading to the interior of the capsule.
"It was designed to burn fiercely for a short time, Majus, to provide a power source for Majus Teju to use. If the real fuel catches fire too soon, it will burn out in an explosion the size of this arena. Many will be injured, and it will be multiple cycles before we can amass this much fuel again. Our flight to Xupara will be scrapped. Can you direct the pilot flame? Can you fly the ship in Majus Teju's stead?"
The woman must have been informed of his abilities.
"We're losing him, Ori!"
Roland called. She had her hands pushed right against Teju, whose head fell back against the railing as if it were too heavy for him. The crew's doctor was trying to investigate the wound as she held pressure, but his hands were already soaked with blood. His doctor's bag next to him splayed open to reveal a variety of tools.
"Even if we got him down from here in time, I don't think Dr. Chitra can save him. There's too much damage."
Her eyes were wet when she stared up at him.
"Ori, help me make my people proud. I don't want this day to be a complete failure."
Origon looked to the dying Teju, to the burning smoke, the crew on the shaky walkway, and to where the shooter had disappeared, far down in the crowd. Who had gone against the trading might of the Methium? Who had disobeyed the wishes of the Great Assembly of 10 Species and the Council of the Magi? Both organizations had given approval to this endeavor. Without a culprit, there was as much chance of sabotage if the Methiumum tried a second time. But if they were able to get to their moon this day, he could do Teju's job, create a portal back to the Methiumum homeworld. Once complete, the knowledge could be disseminated, and travel to Xupara could be an everyday occurrence, protected by the Magi, and from there, farther into Methium's solar system. If he did this, he would be the one to guide the capsule into the sky, remembered as the first Majus to fly a space shuttle. There was really only one choice. Origon pushed up from his crouch on the walkway, running to the capsule's entrance, ears straining for the sound of another bullet whizzing past. None came. The crew followed. One of the crewwomen began closing the heavy door of the capsule behind them, and through it he saw Roland dragging the body of Teju back toward the ladder. The doctor was shaking his head, wiping blood from his hands and packing up his bag. Origon could investigate the body when he got back, assuming he got back intact. Origon stepped through the short hallway to let the doctor pass, then followed the crew to the one circular room at the nose of the shuttle. He reached out with all of his senses.
"I shall be the one to put this capsule on Xupara."
The thrill raced through him.
"The first time members of the 10 Species are traveling in space."
There would be time to grieve for a fallen Majus later, after he returned from the moon. Honor and ceremony would accompany the return, though he pushed the thought away.
"For now, it is critical to concentrate on the task."
Around him, the 8 crew members scurried to various tasks, flipping levers and tallying up sums on chalkboards. Several checked gauges for liquids coursing along walls of the room, and down into the bowels of the lengthy cylinder beneath them. Origon stood near a half-sphere of metal, detailed with ornamental filigree, thrusting up through the center of the domed room. The burnished ceiling missed his top feathers by a hand's breadth, and the diameter was maybe 4 times its height. Polished, riveted walls reflected the light of Methium's morning sun through small portholes filled with thick lead glass. Origon ignored the scurrying Methiumum, feeling the awe-inspiring verses of the Symphony of Power below him, like 1,000 trumpets blowing at full volume. His mind recoiled from the roiling furnace of fuel attached to the bottom of the capsule. Surely this was too much. Once that melody was released to its full potential, it would consume the shuttle. But the Methiumum would not have designed it so poorly. He traced the racing lines of music describing the pilot flames, a candle to the sleeping sun and the tanks of fuel at the bottom of the shuttle. He could hear the shape of it in the languid symphony of communication. Air passed beneath it, blown through a tube by a slight breeze from outside. A small valve stuck closed, but a directed staccato trill, a burst of air, would be enough to switch the valve and let the pilot flame in. It would happen, anyway, if he didn't control the burning pilot light first. It was designed for a Majus to use.
"Is everyone to be ready?"
he asked. There was little time before the pilot flame reached the main tank. Crew scurried around his unfocused eyes, and someone tugged on the sleeve of his robe.
"Please sit and tuck in your restraint,"
said the captain. Origon looked around. Everyone else was seated in reclining chairs around the periphery of the room, each stationed near a bank of dials and levers. They watched, eyes wide, firmly strapped in place. The captain pointed to one of 2 empty seats. Origon sat, and the captain helped him buckle his restraints. His height made the seat uncomfortable. It had been designed for one of average Methiumum stature.
"Is this all to be necessary?"
he complained.
"Quite so,"
the captain answered.
"There, done."
She stepped back.
"Please wait until I have restrained myself, and then feel free to start our journey, Honorable Kyrian."
Quickly, the captain strapped in, then nodded to Origon.
"Our lives will be in your hands."
He realized the captain and crew were terrified to have him here, rather than Teju. He assumed the younger Majus had trained with them. Well, Origon had many more cycles of experience using the symphonies of communication and power. There was really no need to worry. They would all be back by dinner. He relaxed, letting himself float back into full absorption of the symphony, feeling the chords surrounding him. The 2 symphonies were separate, yet connected. Most Magi only heard 1/6 of the full music of the universe, but he was fortunate enough to be able to hear 2 symphonies, 1/3. Each expanded in his mind from a single chord to individual symphonies, to fractal themes swirling within each other, defining the interconnected phrases of power and the multi-layered themes of communication. The capsule faded into the background. He found the catch again, air swirling around it, the opening for almost unlimited potential power. He sensed the tempo of potential and force with the House of Power, saw the restraints that would direct the liquid fire. Yes, that would most certainly lift the ship. He took a deep breath, changed one grace note in the symphony of communication with his song, and flipped the valve open. He was pushed back into his seat, neck straining to hold his head up. Fire surged, more than he could bear. The tempo was a military drummer beating to quadruple time. Notes slipped through his mental grasp, far too fast to handle, much less change. He clawed through both melodies at once. This was the reason he was here, for communication and power had merged into one, burning air and a hurricane of fire. The capsule was rising into the air, gaining speed, listing. Soon it would veer to one side and then back down to the ground, digging a hole and smashing him and the crew into a paste. The air outside the ship. He listened to that comparably languid music, felt the way the ship moved. If he could redirect where the burning air went, he could propel the ship the other way. Notes slid by him, too fast to change, and he had the sensation of hanging. They were moving sideways. The crew might have been shouting, but he could afford no concentration for his physical ears. There was a pattern to the relentless beat of the fuel. He didn't have to catch the notes to change them. He instead saw their pattern, made the new musical phrase, crafted from his own song, ready to insert it. There. The ship righted abruptly, but Origon felt his invested song ripped out of his grip, flying out far beneath them. The ship began to list to the other side. Gasping, his stomach threatening to jump out of his throat, he realized what he should have before. He no longer envied Teju his place here. There was no chance to reverse any of the changes he made. Every change to the symphonies on this trip would be permanent. The shuttle was flying so fast that the surrounding music was in constant flux, notes changing. It would strip each application of his song from his being. If he was not efficient, the flight would drain him to something insubstantial, his song stripped of its notes. His body hung to one side, and Origon made another construction from his music, inserting it into the breakneck beat, wincing as a small portion of his essence was lost. This could only buy time. The flight would be several hours long. Xupara was small and near to Methium, compared to moons of other species' homeworlds, but would serve as a gateway to extensive exploration of the Methiumum system. He would have asked for chalkboard and chalk to make notes, but he could not move under such pressure. This would be by instinct and experience, guiding the ship the smallest amount while keeping to the most efficient path to space. How much had Teju trained for this? He listened for the outer cadenzas of the Symphony of Communication, hearing the air currents far up into the atmosphere above the capsule. Below the tank of fuel, swirls of power and force made the music too discordant to follow. While his mind rode the vibrations of the air currents, planning their course, he wondered if Teju would have been able to handle this job, no matter the training. It was nearly beyond even Origon's grasp. The ship listed again, and he redirected the flow of the fuel with another change, a bit of his song thrust into the symphony at the right instant. He felt weaker already. For a small eternity, Origon molded the symphonies around him, sweat dripping from his brow. His pointed teeth ground together with each jarring rip as his song disappeared into the air. Time flew by almost unnoticed as he put his full concentration into fighting his way through the air, a small sun strapped to his back. He was the capsule. They were moving fast enough that each change to the symphony was distant from the last. It was oddly liberating to repeat the same composition again and again. Yet every time he did so, the song defining him became more a skeleton than a sonata. At some point, the acceleration lessened, and his arms began to rise on their own. His robe billowed out like a multi-hued balloon. Sounds, aside from the internal music of the symphony, intruded on him, like one or more of the crew being violently sick. He would never shame himself like that. He stifled a burp. The melody of the tank of fuel was lethargic now, nearly empty, and he had little need to use his song to effect changes. Origon opened his eyes, blinked, and licked his thin lips, realizing he had not moved or spoken for how long?
What is...
He stopped at his croaking voice and swallowed. The captain twisted fluidly in his direction, no longer pressed down by the great weight of acceleration. A lock of her long gray hair had come free from its bun, drifting like a halo around her head. She was highlighted by shielded carbon arc lamps, throwing great swaths of harsh light around the cabin. A chemical heater protruded from the center instrument cluster, warming the cold interior. Engineers must have installed the newer lights rather than relying on candles, too hazardous in space, or energy stored by a Majus of the House of Potential. The crew fiddled with switches near them. Some had small lanterns to see detail by. He tried again.
What is the time?
We have been traveling for nearly 5.5 hours, Honored Kyrian,
the captain said.
We were worried when you did not answer our calls, but our capsule did not falter after the first few minutes, so we assumed you were busy in your work.
Had they called to him? He searched his memory, but could not remember.
I am named Origon Kairesi, Captain. What is to be done when the fuel tank is empty?
There is a way to detach it with your magic, Majus Kairesi,
she answered.
If all has gone well, you can begin our deceleration with the secondary tank. The hardest part will be landing.
Origon didn't bother to correct the woman's use of magic. He was too tired, and even a few magi thought what they did was supernatural, not a science. He bent his head in concentration, seeking through the symphony for the mechanism the captain spoke of. There. 4 large catches on the side of the empty fuel tank. Origon could feel the latent power, a slow, steady beat behind the explosive bolts. With another wince, he changed their tune in the symphony of power, building the melody to a snappy crescendo with his song. The bolts exploded, and the empty fuel tank sliced away beneath them, no longer on their trajectory. Of course, the change was not reversible. The explosion disintegrated the bolts, and the music describing them. He knew the Methiumum built this capsule by menial methods, but had the designers not consulted a Majus on how to control it in flight? Every little thing seemed planned to use up his potential. It would be a simple thing to modify the architecture. Origon sighed. When he got back, he would track down the designers and have a long talk with them. The melody of communication and power between the crew, the little solos and trills that manifested in their body language, told him they were over their terror and growing more efficient at their jobs. In the depths of the symphony, there was a glimmer of a building theme so strident it would overpower the rest when it was louder. Xupara itself. The house of communication was weaker here, as there was little air, but the capsule was sealed well. He added his own credenza to the melody of the air in the capsule, freshening it. That, at least, was not permanent. He retracted his song, and the breeze died down. The strident theme was growing louder.
"Captain,"
Origon said,
"is there a way to be viewing our destination?"
"Certainly, Majus Kairaisi," the captain answered. She pressed a button, and a section of metal slid aside, revealing thick glass. A neat piece of engineering. Through it, he saw a milky glow beneath them. Methium. Above, a deep swath of black extended in every direction, sprinkled with tiny points of light. Several of the crew gasped, and his breath caught in his throat. Shivers ran up his arms as he fixed the picture in his mind. He would remember it for the rest of his life. Wisps of clouds raced below. Ahead, an irregular round object shone, reflecting light from Methium. It had to be Xupara. One of the other moons rose behind it, larger and farther away. But the rocky surface of Xupara was closer than it should be. Origon said nothing. No sense panicking the crew.
"That will help immensely,"
he told the captain, who nodded back. Origon focused on the shining object and the heavy, rising theme which would direct their course. He would have to land the capsule, or rather crash it with everyone intact. The capsule did not need to fly back to Methium. Those who came through later portals could hack it up for scrap for all he cared. He no longer had any interest in the fine design of the capsule. He let one shaky hand float up, imagining he might be able to see through his hand if he spent any more of his song. But he wasn't done yet. He took a deep breath in through his nose, resettled his crest, and blew the air out. The symphony of power outlined the secondary tank, trills of blocked power humming. The tank had exit ports on all sides of the capsule, controlled by small nozzles, each with a lightweight valve. Once the fuel passed the nozzle, it would catch fire and push the capsule in the opposite direction. It was simple, in principle. There was only one problem. Origon raised his head to scowl at the captain.
"Did your engineers consult at any point with one of the Magi?"
he asked. She visibly paled under his gaze.
"We did, Majus. Is there a problem?"
Origon waved a hand irritably.
"Never you mind. I will be addressing the problem myself."
The subtle vibrations making up the universe could only be pulled and changed so far and for so long. Once he grasped control of the valves to make adjustments, he could not let his focus lag from any of them, lest he could not move them a second time. He would have to maintain a focus on... How many were there? 8 separate valves all at the same time? Teju would never have held the capsule together. He wasn't sure he could handle it, and he had been out of apprenticeship for 40 cycles, not newly raised from apprentice. Origon sighed noisily, and the captain raised her eyebrows at him. The other crew watched, too, but Origon ignored them. Their calculations and buttons did not regrow his song. Why hadn't the Methiumum designed a lever for this job? 8 people could pull levers, guided by a Majus for the correct timing. By the great winged one's beards, he would personally rend the designers of this capsule when he got back. If he got back.
"I wish for absolutely no one to disturb me until this capsule is resting upon Xupara," he commanded. He glared around the room. "The less noise, the better."
Without waiting for a confirmation, he tightened his straps and clasped his long-fingered hands together, concentrating. He heard a chorus of fabric-on-fabric sounds as the crew followed his example. Then silence. Origon stared out of the glass at the approaching moon, listening. With the House of Communication, he could control the 8 valves. Only a glissando was required to turn them on or off, but the notes wavered as if he heard them underwater, and he slumped in his chair. He found the first valve, clutched at the notes, then the second, and the third. His breathing became ragged. 4, 5. He shook, just a little, then reached out and grasped the notes controlling the last 3 valves. The symphony buffeted him as the capsule sped ever nearer Xupara. He had to keep a connection to each valve to adjust any one of them in time. If he lost the connections, he would not be able to get them back. Their speed was the first problem, and he invested his song in 3 valves pointing the direction they were traveling. His hands clenched at his chair's arms as liquid fire rushed past the valves, randomizing the air currents. Sweat popped out all over his body, but the ship slowed. It skewed off course the other way. Ready this time, Origon opened 2 different valves and closed the first 3, correcting. Decelerate. Correct. Stop the twist. Sweat. Breathe. More deceleration. Repeat. Xupara was massive in the front view, and he ignored the captain's plaintive stare. They were going too fast. He wished he could close his eyes as he did for the flight into space, but he needed to see the moon through the glass. That meant more distraction from the crew's twitches and scared faces. Decelerate. More. More. They were going into a twist, but he couldn't correct it at the same time and stay conscious. Some loose object whirled about the capsule. All the force must go forward to stop their movement. Another crew member was sick, and Origon fought down his own gullet. He closed 2 valves, opened 2 others. He had counted on more help from the air itself, resisting their movement, but had miscalculated. Not many realized how much the air weighed, and the medium of communication here was much thinner than he expected. With the small bit of rational thought left to him, Origon considered his options. Overshoot, and they might never land. Crash directly down, and they would most certainly die. What else was left? What could resist their movement? He watched Xupara's ground coming closer at startling speed. From here he could see valleys, short eroded mountains, and large flat plains. The surface itself! The insight put a pointy smile on Origon's face, making the captain's whiten in response. He ignored her and gently aimed the capsule just below the horizon. Prepare yourselves, he told the capsule in general. He heard rustling. The impact jolted through him, his head bending forward, and his chair rattled in its bolts. He felt one of the valves crush, its music ceasing. It was a relief to hold only 7. He eased the capsule up from the surface, but there was a persistent vibration that shook his bones. A range of hills sprang up as they soared over the landscape, and Origon gritted his teeth, opening all the valves on the right side of the craft. They veered left. The capsule trembled and twisted as one corner brushed the side of the highest hill. Still not slow enough! Origon aimed the capsule down at a plane dotted with circular marks, keeping the forward valves open. The capsule bounced off the plane, the impact shaking his chair like a leaf. Something bent with a screech that made his ears hurt. He rocked back and forth, lighter than he should be, as he readjusted their flight upwards to clear a hill. The ship was slowing. One last time he touched the capsule to the surface of Xupara, smashing another 3 valves. He heard the captain grunt. Then there was a crash from his left, and a form flew across his vision. His was not the only loose chair. He did not have time or attention to spare for the occupant. The capsule plowed through the dusty ground of the moon, cutting a groove. He could see a huge valley coming up fast, many times deeper than the capsule was tall. They were rotating sickeningly, and Origon felt for the correct orientation of the remaining valves. Waiting. Waiting. Now! He opened all of them, and the ship rose, listing to the left. The valley sped by underneath them, reaching far into the moon. Someone screamed. The reserve of fuel was nearly depleted. Most of it had gone to decelerate the capsule. He could force them to the ground a final time, using the still intact valves now on the upper side of the capsule, but they would not rise again. He strained to see the edge of the valley, which seemed to take up half of Xupara. Finally, the far edge came into view. Thankfully, a plain, and not a mountain. Origon hoped he had cut enough speed to keep them all from dying. "This is it!" he cried, and let the last remaining fuel guide them forward and down.